But if you were a microbe, then that's not so impressive. Right? If you're a microbe, you might be able to get through that pretty easily. So perspective matters with regard to cohesion. But there's lots of ways things can be cohesive. And so being an object means that your parts are somehow related to each other in a way that they function as a whole object. And that's what species are on the individuality thesis. Species are historical objects that start and end, and the parts are individual organisms, or populations, depending on what your view of species are. And those individual organisms are related to each other in a genealogical way. There's a big family tree. And humans are kind of an interesting one. We're really unique in that our lineage is extremely isolated from any other lineage that's alive today. There's no other species that we interbreed with. That's pretty unique among living species. Birds, for example, pretty much interbreed, at least, well, if you believe Coin, birds typically have at least a 5% intergression rate. And so most species kind of interbreed a little bit. But that works okay with the individuality thesis, because rather than being defined as belonging to a species by having some property intrinsic to that individual organism, you belong to a species by virtue of the relationship you hold to other parts of that species. And that relationship can get really complicated with species that sometimes interbreed. And so the edges and boundaries of these objects can be a bit more attenuated. But that makes sense in the metaphysics of individuality. It's harder to make sense of that on a natural kind. Okay. The individuality thesis also doesn't tie being a species to any particular set of properties. So species can change what kind of properties are being expressed, what kind of characters or traits are being expressed by its parts without losing its identity as a species. Now, how much of that can happen before people start calling it a new species is really controversial and really depends on what you think a species is. All right. So let's step back a little bit. We're almost finished. So I've been going on and on about individuality thesis. I use the Vitruvian man to kind of indicate the notion of ideal or type form of man. But we know that doesn't really tell us much about what it is to be a human. People could vary quite a bit from this, and there's no question about their humanity. And in fact, we know, right, there's an incredible amount of variation and diversity in the human species. So variation is the norm. There's also no special status. We're not special among living things. I mean, we're as special as other living things. How about that? We're a branch on the tree. But that doesn't mean we're closer to some higher way of being or some typological ideal. And this suggests, at least, that at least the traditional way of thinking of human nature is completely outdated and irrelevant. There is no human nature for us to discover that tells us who we are, why we're the way we are. Now, bad news might be putting it harder a little bit more. But this is clearly threatening to many people, and it threatens lots of worldviews. It challenges our status as special objects or special creation. It also threatens, on many views, our moral standing. And evolution, as an ethical guideline, at least historically, we'll say has mixed reviews at best. So I put eugenics and social Darwinism up there. And the reason I chose those two is that they cross political boundaries. So regardless if you're a conservative or if you're a progressive or somewhere in the middle, those different movements, which have been discredited, have a pretty bad history. And so this is worrisome to people. And because people don't like this result, there's been a lot of challenges to evolutionary theory. The good news, I find it actually something to embrace. And I find it really freeing that there is no ideal typological form that none of us live up to. That instead, being human means being part of an individual. And that being human means we stand in different relations, in particular special relations, to every other human. And that we expect variation. And David Hall has a great article called On Human Nature, which you can see has a similar title to mine. And in that he argues, he considers, well, what kind of ethical norms can we draw from evolution? And he considers, and he goes, well, really, very few. What we know is that variation and diversity is what we expect. And it's easy and often that we see claims that certain behaviors or ways of being are not natural, or somehow less than human or deviant. And this, Hall argues, is a mistake. This isn't to say there's no deviant behavior, but it's to say that the variation that we see among populations isn't anything that has any moral force or normative force to it. And that appeals to naturalness, appeals to biology as a way of justifying normative claims about naturalness fall flat. And I think that's exactly right, and I think it's an incredibly important lesson from evolution. So I actually think he's kind of wrong that there's no normative force. I just think the normative force isn't what people typically take it to be. Okay. Finally, what about teleology? Well, evolution has no purpose. This doesn't mean that it's random, but random isn't what people often think. It's probabilistic. But I thought that the best way to make the point that good things can happen because of evolution without us being teleological, I think was best expressed by a really nice commercial. So let me see if I can play this for you. Thank you very much. I think I have time for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering what some of the arguments are for reworking the definition of natural causes. I know you said you didn't want to touch too much on it, so I'm just curious why I really can't do this.
So the question is, what are the arguments for reworking natural kinds, and also why in the world would anybody want to do that? I emphasize that a little bit. Well, some of those arguments are, basically, there's a trilemma. So we have a trilemma. So dilemmas have two, right, so three lemmas. So species are paradigmatic natural kinds, natural kinds are defined by essential properties. Modern evolution tells us, or contemporary evolution tells us, that species have no essential properties. So you can't hold all those to be true. So typically people just get rid of, or tease them and call them many, just say, well, we're wrong about species. Well, another option is to say, well, let's rework what natural kinds are. So some have argued that we should think about extrinsic properties as the kinds of properties that can define natural kinds. So then something like history can become a property that's an essential property. And it actually does a lot of the work that we want essential properties to do. It explains all the characters that something has. It identifies something pretty well as that's that thing, and that's why it's that kind of thing, because it came from those kinds of things. So it can do the work. The problem is I just don't see the motivation for it. I think the only reason philosophers want to make those sorts of moves is because they're so committed. I mean, there's 2,000 years of inertia of thinking of species as natural kinds. And so on the one hand, I kind of applaud the idea of accepting that and, come what may, whatever species are, that's what natural kinds are. But I think it comes at a huge cost, because then it means that all the other ways we thought about natural kinds for the last 2,000 years turns out to be wrong. And it turns a lot of philosophy over, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't see the motivation. I think I'm happy just not thinking about species as natural kinds. I think it's more interesting anyways.
So I have a bunch of thoughts, and they may or may not lead to a coherent question. So I buy into the notion that what I would call the Platonic, as opposed to Aristotelian view of species, was a major impediment to our thinking about evolution today.
Yeah.
They're just not very compatible, right? And I liked your notions of individuality, but where I couldn't quite hang on to the ride is this notion of that implication of there not being sets. That's what you said. Because I buy also into this notion. It's basically a continuum if you go back in time. The difference between generation X and X plus 1 is really trivial, but it accumulates. And we nominally